Very good. Listen, thanks very much. And you're all very welcome here tonight. It's a bit of a cold night tonight, so it's a great night for having an online talk. My name's Jim Bradley. I'm a manager of the Belfast Hills Partnership, and we have Elaine Armstrong, who's our marketing officer, here to help tonight. I want to talk to you about the old names of the Belfast Hills, and that sort of amalgamates both the townland names, secondary names, and also the surnames of those people who've been living in the hills, some families for hundreds of years. So that's what we're aiming to do. Hopefully it'll take about an hour, but that depends how off track I go, I suppose. For any of those that don't know exactly where I'm talking about, we're talking about that area that's that line of hills that's along the north and west of Belfast. And that's the area that Belfast Hills Partnership, our organisation, we're a small charity that are trying to improve the management of the hills. And we're very much usually associated with wildlife and land management and volunteers and tree planting, things like that there. So that's the area that we're talking about. And it's a really interesting area from a heritage point of view, because it's both upland and it's rural, but it's so close to Belfast. So it has a mix of all sorts of heritage. As I say, we're very much involved in wildlife and land management. So sometimes people find it strange that we talk about heritage, about townland, and about the history of the area. But of course, they're all connected. And later on, I'll talk, and specifically in terms of the townlands, why it's so strongly connected to wildlife. So what sort of names do we have? What am I talking about when I'm talking about the names that we have across the hills? We have the old townland names. Townlands is a very interesting way of plotting out the countryside, the land. It's a way that the areas have been split up and managed, and from a legal point of view, quite often those names have survived for over 1,000 years. So quite often when you go into legal documents, when you're registering to vote, etc., your townland name will come up. You'll see it in your deeds, etc. And it's relatively rare or pretty much unique to this part of the world, and it's a fantastic local heritage, and it tells us so much, as I hope I'll try to explain in the next few slides. Those are the townland names that are survived, but there are some that have got almost sort of squeezed out, and these townlands, some of them grow bigger, some of them grow smaller, some are forgotten about. Some of them take over their neighbouring townlands, as it were, depending on how areas develop and populations shift. So we do have these, what we call secondary names. These are names that are lost in terms of their official townland status, but in many ways they almost tell us more about what's happening with their heritage. So it's a sort of, as most heritage is, it's a sort of living, developing thing. But the secondary names give us clues to areas that are much less, I suppose, researched. There's a fantastic website called Place Names NI that give you an amazing amount of information about the townlands. But the secondary names are a bit more forgotten about, and sometimes are at least as important. And of course, then we've got the surnames. Some very old surnames that have lent their names to some of the hills, for instance. And then, of course, we have new names, particularly when you're talking about the area along the urban areas. There's lots of new names coming, but I want to talk about that in some detail. And then after that, we're going to be talking about the field names. Very interesting. At a time, every field more or less had a name. Sometimes a rather boring name, like the big hayfield, etc. Sometimes it had much older names, much more interesting names. We tried to do a little bit of work about that. There are some fantastic examples of that work, but you do run into some real problems, which I'll talk about near the end of the talk. This links in with some of the other work that we've been doing. We've been holding a series of digs, and this has exposed a lot of information. Some of it going back 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 years ago. Some of it just going back a couple of hundred years. So we have various sites, such as up at Divis. We're unearthing clay pipes from the 1700s, etc. And you do wonder who these people were and whether or not we know anything about these people, and well, what were their names, for instance. So it always raises those sort of questions. To a degree, the townland names gives us some clues to, so maybe going back quite a few hundred years. Remember that it's our ancestors, the people that lived in and around areas such as the hills, who have come up with those names. So they give us an idea of not just how they would describe it, but what was important to them. So they would name, why would they pick those names? I mean, just looking at the names behind that writing, you can see, why did they call Colin Ward Colin Ward? You can see that some names are in English, some names are derived from Irish. We have a few Ulster Scots names as well. So there's a whole variety of sources for all of this information. But I think for most of those, I'll be giving you some indication of what those mean. But they're literally the words that our ancestors have used to describe these particular areas. So that's one of the reasons why it's so important. It gives us an idea of what was important to them. I didn't mention what's quite an old leaflet now, outlining, I think there's about 26 or 27 of the townlands that stretch across the Belfast Hills. We're quite lucky in that we're just about the right size to deal with a lot of these more detailed heritage investigations, as it were. So we still got quite a few of these leaflets. If you want to give us a phone, and we'll post them out or drop in. And these give a translation or an estimate of what every one of these townland names mean. This was all derived very much from the expertise that was supplied by Place Names NI. It's associated with Queen's University Belfast. If you want to start an argument, you can start talking about the meanings of townland names, and some people get very uptight about if the name doesn't agree. So that's why it's good to have a single source of information. I have to say that the people that compiled this in Place Names NI had fantastic depth of knowledge, not just in terms of linguistics, but in terms of how the townland names work. Some of them are very basically named after the physical features. So you get things that are called hills, you're talking about ridges, Divis. Divis and the Black Mountain. Divis is basically the Black Ridge or the Black Mountain. So those two townlands are beside each other, more or less mean the same thing. You do actually then also get a bit of geology coming in. Liganeel is the hollow of the lime, and Slieve na Clough, townland of the stone. And you do get stone mentioned quite a few times in some of the, not just some of the townlands in and around the Belfast Hills, but also in right across the country. So you've got those basic, simple explanations of hills, ridges, tops, etc. So that's relatively to be expected. Then you have things that you're beginning to see names that are coming in, such as Ballysillan, that are named after, for instance, the first three are named after different trees. There's actually a couple more I can think of. Budor is, which we'll refer to later on, is referring to oak. So again, this shows how important this was in terms of how important nature and wildlife was in the day-to-day lives of our ancestors. Auchnabrack is a wonderful old name for Wolf Hill, and brack is supposed to be one name for wolf. You have birds as well. You have Slieve na Gregory, the hill of the mountain of the woodcock, which I always think might be the snipe. It's full of snipe still. And then you have a really interesting one, which is actually a secondary name, to be honest, Altna Key, which is the height of the cuckoo. And if you're ever walking into Divis and you look way over to your left, there's trees way in the distance at the bend of the Divis Road beyond Divis and the Black Mountain. And that area there is called Altna Key, and it's named after the cuckoo. And that's a bit of a view of it there. There's the trees in the distance. And one of the last places that I've most recently heard the cuckoo is up in those trees. If you'll be aware that the cuckoo sits up at a high point, such as the tree, and one of its, two of its favorite hosts are the meadow pipits and skylarks that are living in amongst the moss and the low grass, stretching out across Divis and the Black Mountain. That name Altna Key is about 800 years old, so that would suggest that the landscape was probably quite similar to what we have there today in terms of moss and grassland, wet grassland. So we, as I say, we still get the cuckoos coming up there. So it gives us an indication of what that landscape looked like many hundreds of years ago. Farming, obviously, always has been and always will be an important part of how we manage the hills. And of course, there are areas that are named very much with a nod towards farming. Per Old Ballybot, it's a very much a north-facing side of a hill heading towards Mollusk, and it's more or less the townland, per ground. Altagarin is the northern half of Divis the Black Mountain. It's the glen of the horses or geldings. If any of you are fans of Game of Thrones, if you ever read the books, the very first page is about one of the heroes on his Garin, his horse. So that's just an old name for a gelded stallion, a horse. So we've got an area that's named after horses. There's another one actually, Aughrim, down towards Slieve na Cloy, is the height of the horses as well. So they all reflect what's important or what was important in the hills. And of course, if you're driving through the hills, you'll see horses in quite a few places, still quite important. Ballygo Martin and Ballymagary, townland of Martin's Field, or townland of the field or garden. Those also correspond quite closely to those, well, I would say the better ground, the good ground. They're still agricultural enclosed fields. So that's quite, that again reflects what was important as far as that local area is concerned. So that's another aspect of where, when you group all these townlands together, what was important to the local people. Then you have fortifications. You do have, well, the very first one actually is both fortification and is religious, I suppose. As you're traveling up the M2, you're going between Carnmoney on your right and Cave Hill on the left. And on the top of Cave Hill, you've got McCart's Fort, which we think is an Iron Age fort, and another name for that is Ben Madigan. But over to the right on Carnmoney, there's a wonderful old Iron Age fort, and that's how that area gets its name, Dunanny. Dun is another name for fort or rath, and Anya is actually an old Celtic goddess that's quite often associated with mountains and hills. There's 2 or 3 hills down south, for instance, and mountains that are specifically named after Anya. So you've got a religious aspect to that as well. Then you have Greencastle. That's an old castle that in some of the older maps was named Costello, as you can see there, Costello. And then you got Castle Robin down to the very southern end as well. So you've got that mixture of names derived from Irish and English, and we've, as I say, we've got a few Ulster Scots ones as well. And then that brings in, as it was mentioned with Anya there, that these religious stroke cultural aspects as well. I did mention Budor as referring to oak, but it's really the oak hut or hermitage. And on that theme as well, Bovulcan, which is a townland west of Slieve na Cloy. It's heading down towards Stonyford, and that's St Alkin's hut. And St Alkin has a strong link with Loch Ness coming out to here, and the northern end of Loch Ness and way up to Rasharkin. So there's that religious aspect. You also then have Colin Ward, which is now just been bought over by, more or less, the whole townland's been bought over by the Woodland Trust, and they have the Glasner Braddon woodland on there. But Colin Ward means the Hazelwood of the Bard. The Bard is strongly associated with Cave Hill, because Cave Hill, we think, was a coronation site for the local O'Neills, and the key person playing a role in that coronation was the Bard. It was their role to go through the whole genealogy of the O'Neill, which is why this wonderful person's going to be crowned now, as it were. So there's that oral tradition of learning the family of the important O'Neills or whatever the important lords or kings were. So there was a Hazelwood associated with the Bard, and of course the Bard was often awarded with land around the coronation site. Quite often, actually, it was their job to also look after that site. So the Bard for the O'Neills, both the ones that are here and way over towards Tyrone and north of Loch Ness, that was a family tradition, that it was Hagans or Hawkins that were the bards for the O'Neills. And so we know that the Hagans or Hawkins were associated with Tully Hogue as well. So Colin Ward is just beside the coronation site up at Cave Hill. This is all a bit speculative, but that's why a lot of these names are based on myths and stories as well as facts. Then you've got Turnagruff, which is one of our lesser known ones, and that's Standing Stones Hill. That's that hill that you see as you're driving out of Divis. It's at the back of the car park. Turnagruff, that translates into Hill of the Stacks, but that's actually the stacks mean the stones, the standing stones that are right to the back of that hill. So you can see there's a whole range of different reasons why that show how important religion, obviously, fortifications, farming, wildlife, the landscape, these are all important things. And that's why our ancestors of many hundreds of years ago named these places along these themes, as it were. And then finally, one of the big links is, of course, naming sites after people themselves. Ballyachagan is that townland that takes in most of Cave Hill, especially over down to the west, running towards the upper Hightown Road. So Ballyachagan is, again, a reminder of that Bard family. Then you have Ballymurphy. It's good to have ones that are pretty clear, referring to the surname Murphy. Ballyvaston actually links in with a name that's associated with an Anglo-Norman name, Weston. There was an old castle Weston somewhere around Hightown area. It's been lost now, but there's a western castle, Ballyvaston. Ballyculloe, which is sort of the upper part of Colin Glen. Place names NI say it's associated with the name McCulloch. Ballyculloe. Culloe just sounds so close to Cull is another word for hazel. But I'm going to bow to place names NI, they know more than I do. And then you get places, I've only got Hannistown here, but I could rhyme off so many of these in terms of Andersonstown, Stewartstown, and I'll show you quite a few more as well. So later on you have all of these, 2 or 3 buildings, 2 or 3 families together, suddenly that becomes a town, Hannistown. And then you got Ballyduff, which is named after Macalduff. Duff is a bit like Divis, it's named after dark or black in Irish. So that's another aspect of, and a key aspect of our townlands, that they're named after people. And to a degree then we'll go and look at how long ago these people may have been living here. Glengormley is another one, of course, Gormley is another one. So these names will go back hundreds and hundreds of years. So this is the connection between townlands and surnames, of course. Then we have those secondary names that I was talking about. I've already mentioned alternate key. So when you look at maps, you'll see this big townland like Divis or Ballymurphy written across it. And then below it, behind that, you'll see these smaller names, especially in the earlier maps. And this is a really interesting section of maps because you've got right across, you can see you've got alternate key. Up the top, you might be mistaken, you see Craigs, that's just another word for crags or for hills, for stone. So you'll see that in 3 or 4 different places around Divis in particular. But you can also notice down the bottom right, Armstrong's. So that's Armstrong's Hill. That's over to the left as you walk into Divis. It's Armstrong's Hill. And that's actually associated with the family, Thomas Armstrong. He was a United Irishman. So we know that that dates back into the 1700s. But I'll be talking about other names that are written across the maps that go well back before that. So so you start to see not just secondary names, but also surnames written across whole stretches of ground across the hills. This might not look immediately recognizable, but that road running down along the bottom right is the Falls Road. So what you're looking at there is the city cemetery, and the lower section is Falls Park. Now, why am I showing you that? It's because when looking at some of the earlier maps, and we now have fantastic web pages, Prony Map Viewer, historic map viewer from the Department of Communities that have wonderful collections of old maps. You can go right through all the Ordnance Survey maps, and right enough just at the western section of the Falls Park, you've got that named Drumaclochan. Now that's a relatively, I wouldn't say boring, straightforward name. I would think that just means the sort of the hill or the ridge of stone. But that name's been lost. Anybody I ask that knows Falls Park or knows local townlands, that's new to them. So the more you look at some of the old maps now that they're appearing online and are easy to get, you'll come up again and again with these strange little names that still tell us, in the same way as the townlands, still tell us what was important to the people who came up with that name and referred to that name on a day-to-day basis. So there's always more to find and always mysteries as far as what's about. Now let's just see what other ones there is. This is one of the most interesting, or the ones I can't really get right. This is up towards Glencairn. So when you look to the left, you see there's a sandstone that sits on the edge of the National Trust property. You see just above that, it's Mount Gilbert. Now, I don't know if Gilbert's a surname or a first name, but I think there's a Mount Gilbert school down below this. That this is heading up the old Glencairn Road above above the Glencairn Park. And can you see down at the bottom right, you've got this word Dargie, D-A-R-G-I-E. And I can't for the life of me, I've asked so many people, I can't work out what that means. And it's there for 2 or 3. It's a big rocky hill that holds in a really interesting wetland. Dargie is a Scottish surname, but that's all I can find out about it. So there's some names that are probably going to remain a bit of a mystery, but that's a name I would love to find out what that actually means, because each of these words tells us something about that bit of ground and how it was viewed. Listen, I'm going to take a 2-minute break there. Quick cup of tea, stretch your legs, and we'll be back again in 2 minutes. Elaine, can you unmute people? And can you, is there any questions in chat, or is it too early?
We've no questions in the chat at the minute, but everybody, you're free to ask one verbally if you feel like it, but just be aware that we are recording at the minute. Yeah.
So and listen, we are, yeah, and we'll keep it to 2 minutes if there's no questions. Just give you a wee chance to stretch your legs if so. But if you've unmuted everybody, seems to be a lot of, yeah. Give me a chance to get my breath back. Oh.
There's a wee question in there. I'm just asking, was Robin's Well on the previous map?
No, and actually that Robin's Well would be up about here, just above the A in Ballymacarty. And we don't really know who Robin was. I think that's a surname. So if you drive up to the very top of the Glencairn Road, we've got an old picture of an open well. It's very similar to the well at the Springfield, at the top of the Springfield Road or the White Rock Road. And there was a strong tradition that people who were going to climb the hill, say on a Sunday, would stop with usually an empty milk bottle and fill up at the well. Those are the numerous springs that we have along the front of the hills. There's a range of those. There's Brian's Well down towards Colin, which is actually named after Brian Boru. But that's Robin's Well. As I say, we've got some old photographs of that we could show as well. I just need to get those out. And I don't think that's marked as Robin's Well in any of the maps, but as I say, you can go into Prony Map Viewer and flick through it. You find that place and flick right through it. It takes a little bit of getting to know how to do it, but after about 10 minutes, you should be able to handle it. But I warn you, you'll start to get to wander off and see the Standing Stone to Mount Gilbert, Giant's Grave, up towards Liganeel, the old caves, the Crow Glen, and you'll waste many an afternoon or evening looking through the maps. Any other questions, Liam?
We have someone in there's put in a link just to information on the Darby family, so that might be worthwhile looking at.
Yes.
And
I can't find Dargies in the list of tenants and the Griffiths valuation, which I'll be talking about a little bit later. But who knows what they are. That road that you see heading out up north of Mount Gilbert goes to what's now an abandoned farmhouse that was lived in by, perhaps built by John Dunlop, the guy who invented the pneumatic tire. He's always associated with the centre of Belfast where he worked, but he lived up there as well. Any other questions before we start again, do you think, Elaine?
Just one last quick question before we move on. Somebody asking where the Hatchet Field was.
Where the Hatchet Field is? It's if you're somewhere around, let's say, the West Link. Please don't do this when you're driving, but if you're a passenger in a car on the West Link and you look at the Black Mountain, about right in the middle of the Black Mountain, about 2/3 the way up, you'll see a lighter field with some trees on it, sitting on its own. That's the Hatchet Field. If I get a chance after this, I'll be able to show you on the map. It's one of those things that when it's pointed out to you, you'll then see from there on. But and it's sort of the shape of a hatchet, and that's why that's called that. But that used to be on an old road that would go from the whole way up Ballygomartin, straight up that slope up to what's called the Windy Gap, and then would pass behind the Black Mountain Quarry straight to Hannistown. That was a very old road that was there in the 1800s. Okay. Any other questions before I start again?
There's no more in the chat there, so if you just want to
Right, okay.
move on, Jim. Yeah.
Yeah. Right, so right now I want to talk about a little bit more about actual names that are written across some maps. As you'll know, you may know if you've seen previous talks, I'm a little bit of a fan of maps. So this is a 1657 map. And I always think that it's wonderful to see the size of Belfast with Lord Chichester's house, which is the Castle Place, where British Home Stores used to be. It looks tiny compared to this massive mollusk area belonging to Mr. Walsh of Mollusk. Look at it, it's a massive, massive area. But really, I wanted to talk about this area here. And if we look at that in a bit more detail, you get names that some of which you could recognize today. Shaw's Bridge. So that's dating right back to a Shaw, Colonel Shaw, actually from the mid-1600s. You got Major Reynolds' house. That's beginning to point you towards, this is a military map, more or less. This is all about recording what's where from a military point of view. Of course, 1657 was quite an active period, let's just say. And then you get Mr. Harrison's house. So you get names that you'll recognize. Just below that's Castle Robin, named after Robert Norton of Templepatrick. So even the very oldest of maps had names written across them, some of which were going to survive and some of them were going to disappear. And if in particular you're trying to push your family tree back, you always hit a terrible wall when you get before earlier than the 1850s. There's the Griffiths valuation, there's your baptisms and marriage records, which only start in the 1860s. So how do you find out about at least your family name and where your family might have lived going back into the 1700s? Some people are lucky if the baptisms and marriages and deaths are recorded in those minority of churches that have got those old records. But the one thing I would say that maybe a lot of people haven't thought about is there's always the chance of picking those names up in terms of at least what areas people would have lived in old maps. And of course the estate maps, those maps that were recording who the tenants were, as a fantastic alternative way of pushing your potential family tree back. This is the Earl of Hertfordshire's map of tenants. It was actually on calfskin and vellum, which explains to a degree why it looks so blurry. But that's Lisburn right in front of you there. And if we take an even closer look, you'll see names written all over this: Bensons, Burtons, Jacksons, Murrays, Browns, Hoggs, some of which will have disappeared, some of which will still be there, Porters, all sorts of names. And of course, even going back to the 1720s and 1730s, you can also have those estate lists of tenants. Of course, these were the people who owned or were the major tenants. If you go on up, right up in the hills, sometimes it becomes much simpler. This is Slieve na Cloy, and it's just split between Ralph Smith and Henry Hamill. Hamill's is a very strong name in the hills. Smith, well, of course, Smith is the one name you don't want to see in your family tree if you're trying to go back, because there's so many. But so that makes life quite simple. But that doesn't mean that Henry Hamill and Ralph Smith were up here trying to make a living off the ground at Slieve na Cloy. They may have just been the middleman in terms of tenancy. So when you start to think, when you're going back to the 1700s, the people that were actually working the ground, the people that were digging these ridge and furrows, these lazy beds, gosh, this is a scene you could see today, isn't it? It's a fantastic, this weather is fantastic for seeing features that you don't normally see. So these are the old cultivations dug by hand. Lazy bed's a terrible name because it was hard work. So these, this picture here in particular is up at Hannistown, which we'll be referring to later. So the question of who were actually the people who were farming the ground, digging the ground, shaping the landscape that we have, that needs a bit more digging, as it were. Those people who were building the lime kilns and using the lime kilns, for instance, this one up at Slieve na Cloy. So how do we get those down to those names of all the people that built the structures and made the hills what they are? You still get a real tendency to get the big names, as it were, the rising classes. This particular map here, for instance, by Lendrick, this was really a guide to merchants and to salespeople as to who had the money in and around Belfast. This was actually a map that numbered the big houses and the mills in and around, for instance, in this particular circumstance, up around Cave Hill. Can you see Ballyachigan? Can you see the spiked fence that's around it? That's the deer park, actually. Isn't that an interesting representation of the deer park there? I'll draw your attention to number 8 and number 4 and 5 at Skeganeel, which is the hawthorn of the O'Neills. Okay, so, but this map here with those red dots, that was a guide to tell people who lived in them. For instance, number 8. Number 8 was Arthur Bunting. So these were the big landowners. If you wanted to do business, these were the people to get in with. So you've got all these names. Some of these names are recognized. Gare is a big name of around Milltown and Derryachy. That was the Reverend Gare in there. So once you start to pull all the different sources of information together, they all start to fit. I love this particular map here. It's done in 1820. It's of Divis in the Black Mountain. All of these were done to exactly note how much land was there and the value of the land, as it were. So again, if we zoom in a bit closer, this shows us some of the names that were about, for instance, around Hannistown. John O'Hara, John Dornan. Those are two names that as far as I'm aware, aren't around, but McCants is a famous name. McCants is Glen. One of my favorite names is here, Hercules Dean. And Hercules Dean owned the middle section of Black Mountain. You've got Grogans, you've got Abernethys, you've got a Thomas MacAleese. Now that name there in this, I got a woman in Mullen in Australia got back in touch asking, did I know anything about Thomas MacAleese that lived in the foothills of the Black Mountain? And there you are, there's the name. So that actually that could show me exactly which fields that was referring to. I could work out from, I'll show you the Griffiths valuation, that Thomas MacAleese was associated with that ground there. It's a wonderful story. Thomas McAleese, exactly around 1800, he joined the Enniskillen Fusiliers, who went out to the West Indies to fight as part of the battle between Great Britain and France, and was there for many years, and actually came back. The family was telling me they came back to his wife and family with a woman from the West Indies who lived her days in a shed next to their farmhouse. So lots of stories. Sometimes you do your family history and you find things you don't want to find out, or you do want to find out, but that's certainly a wonderfully interesting snippet. So there are people who are looking for these old names and they don't know that they're written on the maps. Now, it'd be a fantastically difficult job to go through all of these and list these names, but it's possible, and it's something that we hope to do in the coming years. If you're looking for relatives in the southern end, the Lisburn end, you have a wonderful source of information that goes before Griffith's valuation, which I'll talk about later, that dates from the 1850s. The estate managers and the agents are always doing a fantastic job of making sure they got as much money out of their ground as possible. So they would make exact copies of maps and keep every detail of every tenant that they could. And that tells you not just about the names that are literally written across this in pencil, but also area names. Can you see this is the entrance to Slieve na Cloy? Maybe some of you know it, maybe some of you don't, but you can see it saying it's a road that's coming from Gorman's Mountain. Gorman is a name I've never heard of. So next time I hear if anybody asks about Gorman, I know that could be associated with the hill at Slieve na Cloy. You'll see the name Charlotte Grogan written across there, and it's numbers 1, 2, 3, 9. Look at the amount of detail we have here. There's Charlotte Grogan there, all numbered. And so you have original names. John Sylvie, I've never heard of that name Sylvie before. But then you could see you don't just get the names of the tenants at that particular time. They then wrote in lots of other names. James Ireland, Jenkin McQuillan, who's buried just above us here on Hannistown. So a fantastic resource of names. Some of these names are very much still associated with the hills. Sinclair, Steele, Hamel, Kennedy. Some of them have disappeared. That's what happens with names. Whether people, the lock, stock and barrel, emigrate to America, Australia, or whether they just have a family of children, girls who marry and change their name, or children that don't get married and die out. There's actually a formula for how often your names die out over generations. So you'll get a whole mixture of names, but just for one small townland, we've got a range of names for that particular period in the 1830s. So a fantastic resource of information. This is an area that many of you, I would hope, would know by now. The road coming in from the middle left is the road going into Divis. That is the barn. And of course, in the 1950s, that road was extended straight on up so that they could build the BBC area. The next time you're walking up that road, I hope you do, or if you've never done it, get out there and have a go. If you look to your right, you'll see there's a river valley. And there are two green areas, green patches, better land to farm, called Johnson's Green and Whiteside's Gap. So the names are literally written across the maps. This dates from the 1850s, 1860s, this map. Those two names, it may be a coincidence, but when you look at the 1660 hearth money rolls, I'm living in Dunmurry at the minute, and I looked it up, and the first two names in Dunmurry are Johnston and Whiteside. I think for the sake of convenience, they just included this area in Dunmurry. And I can't prove it, but I think those names refer right back to the 1600s. So you see a name of a bridge or of a road or whatever, don't assume that it's just 100 years, 150 years old. It can refer way, way back. And again, there's no Johnsons and no Whitesides in the comprehensive list of tenants in the 1850s, 1860s Griffiths valuation. So those, it would suggest those names go way back. This is another little hill, McElwan's Hill. It's up just to the west of Squires Hill. It's at the back of sort of the Crumlin Road direction. You'll see it's a funny spelling. That could be sort of like a McElwain, or it could be McElhone. Again, you could be tempted to think that that's probably a landowner from the 1800s. We actually look at the records of the 1660s. That's named as a sort of a small part of the townland, McElwan's, and you've got Carruth, McKinstry, Steeles, Greers, and Alsons. No Alsons. I don't think there's any Greers living, but there's certainly Steeles, there's certainly McKinstry's. McKinstry skips. Carruth is another local name. So that would suggest that the McElwain, or that this was named after, goes way before the 1660s. And it's just another name for a hill that could go well back before that. So it just shows that the names of some of the hills, that some of them disappear, some of them stay. Those names are quite important to record. I was looking just to paste some as an example for this down towards Stonyford direction, and I first time ever come across McGowan's, and I know nothing about them. So you look at Dundrod, Boomer's Bridge. Boomer's a real Huguenot name. We've got a Boomer's Hill just up close to Mullaglass, and then this is associated with Cooper's Water, and just down from this, the hill that goes down into Dundrod, you've got that line of trees which is called Ireland's Corner, and you'll have seen the name Ireland in that previous 1833 list. So Ireland's were another group of landowners as well. So you begin to see, when you go look through all those maps, there's an amazing range of all these names. Leathamstown, we don't even think, some of you might well know where Leathamstown is, but you can forget that actually refers to a family of Leathams. A town could be, as you see there, was it 1, 2, 3 sets of houses. They were very liberal with the use of the name town. So these were a group of people, and yet again you look at who lives in these in the 1850s, and there's no Leathams. So this is really giving you, if somebody says, look, I'm looking for the name Leatham and somewhere around the southern end of the hills, it's the maps and that will tell them that this is one route to go down. Romanstown, front of the Colin Mountain, another wee group of houses, nothing much more than that. And then going up to the northern end, Upper Hightown Road. When you're flicking over the Upper Hightown Road and heading back down into Mollusk, you're passing what's more or less just a farmhouse now, and that's Kerrstown. And the Kerrs, they may all be living in Canada now or Australia, or they might have all died out and moved, or they might be living in the middle of Belfast, but there's no Kerrs around there now. So you would expect this move and change of people anyway, but it's a real clue in terms of where your ancestors may have come from. So it's going to take a long time, but we're going to be going through these and recording all these names on the map, as it were. I want to talk in a little bit more detail, just for any of those of you that don't know what Griffiths valuation is. And of course, it's literally a list of names. And this, just so you recognize this is Annistown above us here. That's Divis Road traveling up to Divis, and this is the way out. Some of you will be using this as the way to the airport. I want to point out just, well, this, first of all, this townland called Turnaroy. And there's a nice farmhouse sitting there right in the middle there, and laneway down to it. So let's have a wee look at that. I'm sure quite a few of you will know about Griffiths valuation. Griffiths was the guy that was given the job of putting a price or an estimate on every field and building in Ireland. It took him 20 or 30 years. Much of it was done in the 1850s, late 1850s, early 1860s, up at this neck of the woods. And that was a fantastic list of names of tenants and landlords. And if you type in "ask about Ireland Griffiths valuation," you will get this fantastic website. You can go into Griffiths names and put in a name. So I could put in Alec Bradley, County Derry, and that will get straight to my relatives or nickname. It was Paddy Alec. Or if I knew the particular place I wanted to look for, I'd go into this site here, Griffith, this particular page, Griffiths Places, type in Turnaroy, press search, and you get the list of people who lived in Turnaroy. So you've got 17 entries. Automatically you start to see Browns. You see Browns with an E, Adam, William, and Andrew. That's of particular relevance. If you press on this page, I know some of you will know these very well. Some of you will never have seen it. I'll just warn you, once you get started into this, you'll be up all night. So you press on the page and you get this wonderful bit of information here. So for Turnaroy, a number of the field or fields or area, name of the tenant, look at 2A, B, and C, which are the buildings on 2. And Adam Brown lived in it, William Brown, and Andrew Brown Jr. And William Brown was, Adam Brown was a tenant of the Marquis of Hertfordshire, who became the Wallaces in Lisburn. William Brown is a subtenant of Adam Brown, as is Andrew. So Adam had the whole ground, and William and Andrew were getting the ground off Adam. And you go across here, that's the area of ground. I think that's 46 or 48 acres, worth 20 quid in terms of its annual valuation. Adam lived in a house that was worth £2.15 in terms of its rateable valuation. William lived in a smaller house worth £1, and poor Andrew lived in one that was worth 10 shillings. Your average was about 110, 1.5. So you could see who lived in the better house, as it were. And this was all about rates. So that's why the detail was done on that. If you press on the map version, this is what you get here. So every wee strip and every field was included. So the Browns had some of the fields to the north of this new road, as it were, and they had this bit of ground here. And there's a little slider in this map viewer, and you slide it across, you hit satellite and slide it across, and you get that. So you get the modern aerial photograph, and you can see in amongst this conifer plantation that was put in the 1990s, there's a square there. Take a closer look. There's the old building, and it's sort of in deference to this being an old farmhouse, they planted some broadleafs along here, and that's what it looks like today. So you've got two versions of what to do here. You can, if you're looking for Browns, you can find out where they came from if they're part of your family. Or if you just know this area and you've always wondered who lived in that particular house, you can find out who lived there in the 1850s and 1860s using Griffiths valuation. Need a wee bit of luck, but and you can also follow, believe it or not, follow who lived in that. Every 10 years they did a reevaluation, and you can work out who lived there from the 1850s right up to the 1911 census. So you get a really good idea of to trace these surnames, these important names across the hills. For those of you who walk up in Divis, very top left, you can see there's the barn and the wee car park. You walk along a wee bit. Anybody hasn't been, you need to go on the Ridge Trail. You turn right and go along a little trail that takes you the whole way down and takes you down towards the Black Mountain Quarry and down towards a view across Belfast. But as you come to the bottom bit here and you're looking across a very wet valley across at the quarry and what's called the UTV area, there's a strange square just about 60 meters down the hill from the path. So there's the path there, and just a small area away you can see there's this old house. I was going to call it a farmhouse, but it wasn't a farmer that lived in it. And you've got this sort of protective wall around it. You can look by using the 1911 census and a little bit of detective work, because this was always called the gamekeeper's cottage. You can find on nationalarchive.ie the census. So this was actually written by the gamekeeper Samuel Little, who, this is where you find all sorts of information, married for 13 years, 6 children, mostly girls, 1 boy, Charles. So they were living up in that gamekeeper's cottage. And there's reports of various naturalists, people going up to look for butterflies, etc., getting chased off by a gamekeeper with a cudgel. And that would be Samuel Little, who was being very protective of his ground. He lived there in the 1911s. It would be great to have pictures, etc., of him. And lo and behold, we have a great grandson of his came in, Samuel Hutchinson. So I'm very grateful to him for giving us these pictures. Samuel Little was looking after that ground for the Barbers. The Barbers had the shooting rights to that. They would come up to what's called the Divis Lodge behind the barn. And that's where they would, first of all, shoot the grouse, but also then party. And lots of business deals would have been done in the lodge over a good meal and quite a bit of whiskey in front of a nice warm fire up in the hills. To the left and the right are pictures of Samuel Little. In the middle is his son that took over. There's their dogs, quite a different breed from what you might use these days. Samuel was there till 1935. Then Jerry took it over for a while before it was no longer used for grouse. And interestingly, Sam Hutchinson, who's given us these photographs, referred to that middle hill of Black Mountain, which Hercules Dean owned in the 1820s. He called it Stevenson's Hill. And again, I can't find any Stevenson. So lots of little clues as to how to piece all of this together. We've got a long way to go as far as that's concerned. And there's a picture of Samuel Little's children who were working as grouse beaters. Somebody was asking me earlier, did they go and beat the grouse? They went along and got the grouse to fly up and over the guns. And that's along one of the walls. I'm going to go up sometime and find out exactly where that picture was taken. But that shows you a little insight into not only how the hills were being managed, but who lived up there. And they've got lots of other stories of what a hard life it was living up in that. I'll talk a little bit as well about field names, and that's there are some sites that and some areas that maybe quite a few years ago tried to get local people to tell us what the names of the different fields are. And as you might expect, you might get half of them that are coming from Irish. You get quite a few coming from Ulster Scots, Lower Bray here, for instance. And then you get ones with English names, Rabbit Holes, Meadows, Horsefield, etc. But all of them telling you a bit about what they thought different fields were. So I thought this is great. I'm going to do it up in the hills. And I did a little bit of it north of Slieve na Cloy. And initially I was, oh, for goodness sake, this person's just given me names. But some of these names I'd never heard of. Gray's Farm, Ellis's. Ellis's actually became the undertakers down at Dunmurray. McCartney's, McFarlane's name died out. Porter's died out. Braithwaite's. So even though there's not any of the names that would be longer term names that would be associated, maybe going back hundreds of years, derived from Irish, I'm talking about the landscape, etc. Sorry, it was Elwoods that became the undertakers down in Dunmurray. Sorry. This gives some really interesting stuff. Gives a lot of information about World War II, the ACAC gun emplacements, where the army camps were, radar field associated with, there was a false runway just south of this picture as well. So field names, unfortunately, we're getting quite late. We're getting field names. When we ask people, and I've done this back home from around Mahara, where I come from, inevitably, after about 10 minutes talking to someone about the field names, they'll say, it's a pity you didn't talk to so-and-so who passed away 2 years ago, who would have known every field and every name and every person that lived here the last 70 years. And unfortunately, we're starting to really run out of that information. So that's the particular point I want to make as we get to the end of the talk. Names are written all over the maps. You can access these maps on Prony. I'm happy to pass them on if you don't know where this is. You can look at your own local area, and it's amazing how, if you go back and time and again to it, all this information comes to you about names of bridges, names of corners, Sales Corner, for instance, down towards Castle Robin. All sorts of names that suggest who was living there. Maybe not for a very long while, or maybe hundreds of years ago, as opposed to just a few decades ago. The local knowledge is disappearing, and disappearing quick. I'm going to be getting quite worried when somebody comes to me looking for old history, because they're getting worried that I'm not going to be around for too long. So the local knowledge, very sadly, is starting to disappear, and we're beginning to realise what we're starting to lose. But the interest is growing. Particularly the interest in family history. Lots of people are getting their DNA tested, which then start to point them towards names. And there's an amazing fact quoted to me that the number of people who are doing DNA and doing family histories is growing to this extent that in 5 years' time, when you get your DNA done, you'll be able to almost automatically get given a fairly complete family history, because so many of those family histories that were online that didn't really connect are all starting to connect up now. So, and of course you've got to be extremely careful, because people are making wrong and bad links, etc. And some people are getting very uptight about it. But it's getting to the stage now where all that information is being looked for, and that DNA information, the family history, written records, the names on the maps, and local folklore and local knowledge, all of that's going to come together so we get more and more of a complete picture. But there is still information that's starting to disappear. There's a lot of information in old deeds, etc., which of course are private, so you don't really get a chance to see them. But we need to just as a sensible precaution, we need to record as much as possible while we can of all of those names, not just of the field names and of the surnames, but all of those other names that literally put lots of places in the hills on the map. So that's my final point. I think I'm about an hour and 10 minutes. So that's not too bad.